Well, now we're looking at a very different kind of quilt. What's going on here, Jan?
This type of quilt is known as a crazy quilt. They were popular from about the 1880s to about 1910, and this particular one is magnificent. The stitching on this quilt is superlative. This was actually made for a wedding, and it is a Nevada quilt. It was made in Belmont, Nevada in 1898 for the marriage of Marie Humphreys and her fiance Francis. And you can see the initials here in the middle. Some of the work that I think is really worthy of being brought out are, for instance, these floral motifs here. Again, this would all be stitched by hand, but the subtleties in the color. They used variegated yarns and embroidery to create the very detailed work of this milkweed. The pansies, again, the subtleties in color. And then if we can point out over here, there are several motifs which feature fans, and they actually get quite small. And each area where there's a seam, it is embroidered over the seams. So this one is just a myriad of color, a myriad of technique, of texture. You can notice up here there are almost like cherries. The chenille work comes out. I think this is just one of my very favorites, and including, you can see the shoe, fun, different kinds of things. Owls down here, and it's in a particularly great condition. That's what's exceptional. Many of the fabrics at this particular time were made with what was called weighted silks, which unfortunately deteriorate over time. This one has not experienced that. So every patch is in its pretty much premier condition. I really can't see any that is deteriorating. And I just noticed, I'd never seen this before. Look at the flag of the 7 colonies. Isn't that wonderful? The 13 colonies, rather, but it looks like there's a few less there. Anyway.
And it doesn't look faded at all. So do you think it was kept out of the light somehow?
Absolutely. This one was more than likely not used very much at all. Not at all. Because otherwise it wouldn't have maintained this vibrancy.
Election Quilt, November 3rd, 1896. Jan, what are we looking at here?
This particular quilt is unique to Nevada. It's a wonderful example of an election quilt. This particular quilt was created, we believe, for the Lander County election of 1896. And if you look at it, you'll see that this red and white quilt is a combination, or a modification, I should say, of an Irish chain pattern. But in each white block is a name. And doing research on this particular quilt, we were able to determine that each name is a candidate for that particular election. It's not known whether the county didn't have enough funds to support the election or not, or if this was just supplemental. However, it is obvious that each of these candidates was running for office, that this particular quilt was made by a woman who is fondly called Auntie Mary, and it was for the very purpose of raising funds for the election. As part of the supplemental material we actually have identified how many votes each one of these candidates received and who the winners are. So at the moment, I really can't remember which one of these signatures is a winning candidate, but I think this is a wonderful example of how at this particular time, women did not have the right to vote and yet actively participated in politics.
Thank you, Jan. And please stay with us because after the break, we will be looking at more quilts.
Gather around. Now, everyone, this is an exhibit of an Ice Age mammoth. Now, long ago in Nevada, these ancient elephants rummaged through springs and stream beds for food.
Imagine at one time, herds of these huge animals roamed in what might have been your own backyard.
You'd be amazed.
Make me a quilt, make it thick, but not so thick that you lie under it and sweat and then throw it off on the floor in the middle of the night. That's not what I mean. Just make me a quilt.
Unlike many other historical folk crafts, quilting has not faded away. Quilting remains a thriving art form, enjoyed by millions across the country. And one of the nation's most celebrated quilters happens to live in Reno, along the Truckee River at the newly created Artist Studios in the historic Riverside Hotel. Monica Calvert is considered by many as one of the most highly skilled quilters working today. In 1986, her Statue of Liberty quilt was declared among the most important quilts produced in the 20th century. Monica, these quilts of yours that are hanging on the wall strike me as very different from many of the quilts that we've been looking at the Historical Society. They're traditional, I guess. They have a certain pattern. What is it that's different here about your quilts?
Well, first of all, I'm in a different century than most of those quilts were made, and we now have the right to be much more free in our design.
If you could turn the clock back and have seen at that time into a crystal ball and be able to see this quilt that's right here, would it shock you? I mean, the colors in here are extraordinary.
Well, sure, there was nothing like that in those days, you know. This one was designed for students, and I thought very carefully about every line that went on the paper so that they could be learning everything I know about what I call random line design. That means no two lines are the same in this work. There is not repeated form here that is identical to blocks or circles or whatever. And I call it random line design because for years, and I don't know if it's still true, wannabe quilters and quilters period were just terrified of art. You say art and I can't do that. Well, of course you can do it. Anybody can do that.
I understand that you won the Great American Quilting Contest in 1986. Was that a turning point for you with your work?
Of course it was. It was the biggest competition ever in quilting and remains the most money ever given for the grand prize. But it was celebrating the statue's 100th birthday, and I wanted it to be very visual. I wanted it to be instantly recognizable anywhere on this planet or any other that it's American. And so for me, the flag, the country, and the statue had to all stack up on that 6-foot square and be equally important, but she needed to be center front. And so, you know, I just went for it. That was my opportunity to do what I wanted to do without anybody saying you can't do that.
And so then you discovered that you could do what you wanted to do.
I could do what I wanted to do. The spikes on her crown, that's where I taught myself to turn points. And that's what I do. These are all points here on this work. But they're not points that are needle point sharp. They're wide. I make things wide, and you don't see that. It all blends together, and it's very doable work. So I taught myself a lot of stuff, even with a lot of years of sewing behind me. I came along, I was already a grandmother before I found the quilt world. To be an artist from the age of 7 is really what put this together at middle age. So, do you want more information on that?
I do. I want to know, out of all the things that you could be doing,
yes,
and all the different kinds of art that exist, what is it about quilting that really pulled you in?
Well, of course, because I've sewn forever. I had to as a kid, and I was making all my clothes by the time I got to high school.
And what is it now, if we could kind of be a fly on the wall, just watching you at your work, maybe not when you're out teaching, but when you're here in this wonderful studio overlooking the Truckee River, what is it that you love about the work?
I love all aspects. Getting it, first of all, the hardest part is getting it out of my head. I draw these pictures in my head and on the paper, the cardboard, the whatever. And then the fun begins with auditioning fabrics to go in the work, which I bring off my shelves, and I start with a whole string of fabric and start laying them out, cutting out some pieces. And
now, I get the impression that you like touching the cloth, that there's something very
sure.
tactile.
Sure. That's from a long, long history of sewing, which is basically 50 years. So I have chosen to use my designs, and that means I drew them all out myself, but I do draw them out, and I cut the pieces apart, and I sew them back together, and it is pieced work. Even though it looks like applique, it is pieced work, and that's the two forms that is basically considered quilt work when you're doing a top. You either piece it or you applique it, or a combination of both.